talk more about what options the U.S. might be considering, we're joined now by retired Colonel Rich Outson, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, as well as geopolitical consultant at Dragoman LLC, joining us from Washington. And retired Colonel Outson, President Trump, he promised the Iranians that help was on the way. Some called it a bluff, but now these aircraft carriers and fighter jets, they're arriving in the next few days. So is this the promised help for the Iranian people, or is this more deterrence against Iran?
Thanks, and it's good to be with you. I think it's more the latter than the former. Deterring something requires that you act prior to its execution, and unfortunately, in this case, with these reports, which I believe of over 30,000 killed in those 2 days of violent suppression, this is one thing the Iranian regime is very good at, is killing its own people to prevent this uprising of political opposition. I think it's a little too late to deter that. The question now is, do you punish it? And in addition, the question is, what regional role for Iran can we negotiate? I think this is where it's not too late. I think that potentially, if we bring in sufficient power and the arrival of a aircraft carrier group provides some oomph to that, you can get some better negotiating terms in terms of the nuclear program and in terms of political reforms and things like that. I mean, Iran has a chance to reform here, but they're not going to do a darn thing unless there is some force applied to them as sort of a boot on the neck. And I think that's what Trump is trying to achieve and split the difference that you saw between the hardliners in his administration and those that want to preserve negotiating space.
So what do we need to be watching for in the next 48 to 72 hours as everything does arrive in the region that would tell us that some sort of an action is actually happening rather than this deterrence?
Yeah, well, so the smaller the gap between those two things, the better and the more effective it's going to be for the Trump administration. They need to convince the decision makers in Tehran that we are absolutely intent on striking. And I think then and only then will you see some concessions potentially made. I think in terms of actual indicators, what you shouldn't look at the movement of U.S. naval forces, to be honest with you. It's sort of routine to bring an aircraft carrier group in or to have one depart. I think the arrival of the Abraham Lincoln Group is good. It's maintaining a force level that we normally have in that area. But what you need to pay attention to is U.S. forces in the region. We have forces in Turkey, we have forces in Qatar, forces in many countries around there. If you see those go to more of a wartime footing where they're indicators that we're expecting some sort of attack. And frankly, with the very close cooperation between the U.S. military, Department of War, and Israel, you'd see some, if we tell the Israelis that we're getting ready to attack, that means we're getting ready to attack. And then you'd see some force posture differences in terms of how many U.S. forces are there to reinforce air defenses, for instance, like when we had this episode last year where we expected the Iranians to be launching drones and surface-to-surface missiles. There was a reinforcement. You see those sorts of indicators on the ground, then I think we're getting much, much closer than the simple movement of an aircraft carrier would indicate right now.
You talk about the United States sending a message with action so that there can actually be some sort of a change within Iran. But if the U.S. does take this military action, what does a limited strike look like so that it can actually stay limited without breaking into more of a full-out war?
Yeah, well, so the question of full-out war comes up a lot. And the thing I'd say about that is that Iran's not really capable of conducting a full-out war, not on equal terms with the United States. They no longer have a viable nuclear program and never, as far as we knew, had operationalized nuclear weapons. They don't have large ground forces. They can't conduct an invasion of a neighboring country. And even their air defenses are very suspect, as we've seen both from Israeli and U.S. strikes. What they can do is launch a wide-ranging campaign of sabotage and assassination. And we do think that they've got agents in Western European countries, in the United States, less so in Israel, that are capable of launching some of these types of attacks. So that's how they would hit back. The bigger problem is, even if the U.S. launches, and either with Israel or separately from Israel, an effective attack on Iran, and what that would look like, in my mind, would be hitting regime-significant targets, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, hitting their command and control, crippling their ability to suppress further protests and uprisings. But even if we do that, Iran is such a massive country, right, with a population of 85 or 90 million. It's much, much larger physically than most of the countries, like as Iraq, that the United States has intervened with before. We just don't know how that plays out. Even if the regime is crippled in terms of IRGC, is there anybody else that's powerful enough to replace them and overthrow the government? So we're looking at a period of chaos. This is a no-win situation for Trump. That's why I think he's gonna push for a negotiated solution to this, but one that involves threatening pain. We'll see if it goes to full war, at least on the U.S. side. And in the meantime, it's probably better than the alternative, which is letting the Ayatollahs get away with just slaughtering 30,000 young protesters with no account.
All right, retired Colonel Rich Outson, thank you very much for giving us some insight into what we could be seeing in the coming weeks here in Israel and
Good to be with
Iran.
you.